December 9th, 1917. The First World War is dwindling to a halt, and the British stumble across an opportunity that will forever seal the fate of the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire, alongside its German allies, are losing the war, and the lands of Asham, the Middle East, are now up for grabs. General Allenby of the British Army, he seizes the opportunity to rectify the failures of his predecessors. And thus, the sounds of marching soldiers are heard throughout the streets of a city that has captivated the minds of Europeans for over a century. That land was Al-Aqsa, Jerusalem. And on that historic occasion, as the British troops are marching their way through the old city, as they're posing for photographs in front of the very Al-Aqsa, General Allenby announces on that historic occasion that the wars of the Crusades are now complete. The 730-year continuous Islamic rule since the time of Salah ad-Din had been broken. The British commander Allenby had done it. He had achieved what his predecessors had failed to achieve. But the Crusades weren't completed. In fact, they had been sparked once more. How did this unprecedented event happen? What led to this, and how did Zionism exacerbate the impacts of this particular crisis? This is a presentation series on the continued battle, the continued struggle for the land of Palestine, the continued oppression, the continued crusade. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. But I'll ask you this question. Why bother coming to a lecture about the history of Palestine? This is events that happened like 100 years ago. Why bother? And I ask you this candidly. Why bother coming to a lecture? Shouldn't we be more focused on what's going on in the ground right now, and the death toll, the live updates? Why are you all here? And I ask you this, and I need some answers. Yeah? Why are you here? You purposely went to this lecture room, you sat down. What were your intentions behind actually coming?
With our non-Muslim colleagues, or even colleagues who aren't aware of what's actually going on, that we have the historical context and knowledge to back up our points.
Beautiful answer. Jazakallah khair. I'll explain it in a nutshell as well. But just elaborating on that, I want you to remember this phrase. Yeah? The history of Palestine will no longer be the history of Palestine if there is no Palestine left. This sounds self-explanatory. But if you think about it, we are living in a day and age where we can't even wave the flag of Palestine. Yeah? Suella Braverman, literally a few months ago, she actually wanted to criminalize waving the flag of a country, of Palestine. Yeah, not only that, we're not even able to call it Palestine. It is being merely reduced to occupied territories or disputed territories. Forget that, when we mention West Bank and Gaza, these are clearly two parts of Palestine. There is no mention of the word Palestine in any of that. It's simply West Bank and Gaza. So this is how, from a top-down governmental approach, the Zionist regime intends to wipe out the idea of a Palestine. Yeah? For them, history began on the 7th of October. And they'll tell you, don't study history before that, it's too complex, too confusing, don't even bother looking at the history of Palestine. Yeah, we've all looked at the video of KSI, yeah, where he goes, it's too controversial to comment on. Yeah? This is clearly a way of deterring you from learning about the history of how Zionism and how Israel was truly formed. They say it's complex, it's confusing, it's too nuanced. I don't know how that's a thing, because when I was 11 years old, they taught me about flipping Henry VIII and his 8 wives. So if they can teach me about that, how could they not teach me about the longest occupation in the modern century? How could they not teach me about the largest refugee crisis of the modern century? How could they not teach us about the largest concentration camp, the open-air prison, which is Gaza? Yeah? So this is their way of preventing you from learning about the history by saying it's complex and it's controversial. So the way this lecture is going to work today, we'll focus on Zionism, deconstructing what it really is. Because if you want to study the history of Palestine, you have to study what Zionism is, and its foundings, and how it's impacted the Ummah. And then the next lecture will be probably one of the most important lectures I'll ever deliver. It is on the 1967 Six-Day War, but more importantly, just before that, 1948, the Nakba. Firstly, what is Zionism? We're going to give you the brief definition of what Zionism is, and as this lecture progresses, we'll develop and we'll flesh more sort of meaning to the word Zionism. But essentially, Zionism means the creation of a Jewish state, not just in Palestine, it's just a general term of establishing a Jewish state. That definition has now changed because there is a Jewish state. So it's no longer creating a Jewish state, it's simply sustaining a Jewish state. And the word Zion, from Zionism, refers to, does anybody know what Zion is? Yeah? Zion means the Temple Mount. So Zion in Zionism means Temple Mount, which is the place where Al-Aqsa is today, yeah, Jerusalem. So that is the idea of Zionism. Since the time of the Romans, the Jewish people have been kicked out of the lands of Jerusalem. Even before the Romans, there was the Persians invaded Jerusalem and they kicked out the Jews. So since then, the Jewish people have been without a homeland. They have fled to places like Muslim Spain. Yeah, even the Ottomans actually welcomed the Jewish people in 1581. They built the Jewish community a synagogue. Yeah, the Muslims built synagogues for the Jewish community in Bosnia, in the Balkans. And so since then, the Jews have wanted to establish a homeland. But people assume that Zionism is this sort of relic of the past, this boogeyman, but it's not. Zionism is a living tradition. Zionism has been at the heart of every single grim milestone in Palestine's history. Zionism was the same ideology which had fueled the early migration into the lands of Palestine. Zionism was the one that fueled the conquest over the Arab, the settlements. Zionism was the one that fueled the subjugation, the Nakba, the annihilation and the purges of the 1940s, and Zionism today is fueling the the bloodshed and the war in Gaza. So Zionism isn't something that has gone in the past, it is a living tradition. So by interrogating Zionism, we can get into the minds of people like Benjamin Netanyahu. What are they thinking, what are their policies and what are their aims for these lands in Palestine? And it's also important to mention that Zionism bang equals Judaism. For non-computer science students, that's always a tongue twister, yeah? That means Zionism doesn't mean Judaism, yeah? Don't conflate the two together. The difference has deliberately been blurred so that it limits criticism of Zionism. If you criticize Israel, you're automatically, the default fallback position of Zionists is to call you an anti-Semite. That is not the case, because the major proponents of Zionism have actually been people who weren't Jewish. They were Christian or they're atheists. For example, the British, as we all know, are a sponsor of Zionism. They're Christians, arguably Christians. The Americans, arguably Christians. And also the founder, you can't even make this stuff up, the founder of Zionism wasn't even a Jew himself. Yeah? So he was of Jewish descent, but he wasn't even a practicing Jew. He was an atheist. As well as the prime minister, the first prime minister of Israel, yeah? He was an atheist. So never conflate the two together. They're completely different. If I do make a mistake during this lecture, please do correct me, okay? But why? Why is there a need for Zionism? Why would you want to support Zionism, and how did Zionism flourish? Well, there's three reasons. Number one, anti-Semitism. We are made to believe that the Muslims and the Arabs are the owners of anti-Semitism. That is not the case. Because since the time of Isa alayhi salam, the propagation, the sustenance of Zionism has been at the hands, par excellence, by the European Christians. They were the ones that even since the time of the Black Death and the Plague, they had always blamed the Jews of doing any wrongdoings in the European world. And if you look at it, historically speaking, the Jews betrayed Jesus. So the Europeans classed the Jewish peoples as sort of these Christ killers, yeah, the betrayers of Christ. So that's why they have not been accepted in the European community. So there was this idea that we need to get rid of these Jewish people. Yeah, we need to ship them off to another homeland and to get rid of them and expel them from Europe. Yeah, and they were used as scapegoats whenever anything bad happened. The second reason is Christian messianism. This is the idea that Christians believe that the second coming of Jesus Christ will only happen when the Jews are resettled in the lands of Palestine. So this idea that we have to enable them to have a homeland so that we can facilitate the second coming of Jesus, which obviously we don't believe as Muslims, but that is one of the reasons. And the final reason are strategic reasons, and we'll build upon this as we go throughout this lecture. But these are basically geopolitical reasons. If you can establish a homeland of Jewish people that are friendly to you in the Middle East, in the darkness of the Arab world, the barbaric Arab world, you can essentially strengthen your influence in those regions and protect your colonial objects like Egypt, the Suez Canal, for example. So Zionism has many origins, but the first idea that the Jews needed to be resettled in the lands of Palestine can be traced back to a French emperor who probably didn't say there is nothing we can do. Does anybody know who this French emperor during the 1700s was? Yes. Napoleon Bonaparte, that is right. Napoleon, he's the French emperor in the 1700s, and on his global quest for domination, he looks towards the Middle East. and he would kickstart European colonialism in the Muslim world, and he would be the first to introduce colonialism in the Muslim world. So in 1798, he invades Egypt, and it is an astounding success. Yeah, he's the first to do it, and he is reaping all the rewards, all the riches of Egypt. He then looks on towards the Levant. The Levant region is Palestine, the Sinai Peninsula, Lebanon, Jordan, those regions. And he goes, hang on, we've just taken Egypt, so why don't we also take these lands, yeah? Because they're very important. If you can see here, this is the Mediterranean Sea. So if you can take these lands, you'll have basically access to the Eastern Mediterranean Sea. So he does, and he begins his invasion. Does anybody know where he begins his invasion of the Levant from? Something that's happening in the news right now, please. Gaza. It happens in the Gaza Strip. Napoleon begins his invasion at the Gaza Strip. Gaza at the time was under the Ottoman control. It was under the Ottomans, and they had furnished it with, lavish mosques. Gaza was a famous port city of the Ottomans. It goes against the idea that, Zionists tell you before, this is why I asked you the question at the beginning, what do you think of Palestine before the Israeli occupation? And it was a port city, yeah? Gaza was they call it a cornucopia, where all the trade from the east, from China, from places like India, it would funnel into Gaza, and then it would be taken and exported to Western Europe. So it was a very famous city. The Ottomans had furnished it with beautiful masajid, beautiful architecture. So he begins his invasion there, and it's brutal, it's bloody. He makes his way now to Jaffa, okay? And in Jaffa, he commits huge massacres. 3,000 are dead, 3,000 are killed, masajid are also destroyed. And he now looks on towards Jerusalem. Because, imagine, you're a French emperor from Europe, and you take back Jerusalem, because it's under the Muslim control. Imagine the prestige Napoleon would get from invading Jerusalem. But he had a small problem, or actually it was quite big. He didn't have the resources to do so. Yeah, this is where Napoleon would issue one of the most detrimental, unprecedented, and also forgotten proclamations of history. He proclaims to the Jews in Africa, and I quote, he invites all the Jews to gather under his flag in order to re-establish the ancient Jerusalem. An official statement from the Gazette Nationale, a French newspaper, states that he has already given arms to a great number and their battalions first in Aleppo. Once again, the proclamation was called the Proclamation to the Jews of Africa and Asia. So he promises to the Jews that, look, if you can support us, bear in mind the Jews in Europe are wealthy bankers. Yeah? So if you can support our invasion of Jerusalem by revolting against your Ottoman overlords, the colonial Ottomans, then we will give you this land in Palestine, Jerusalem. Why would he do that? Any ideas? Why would you give seemingly Jerusalem over to the Jews if they helped you? What are the benefits? Number one, by creating a Jewish state, a friendly Jewish state in Palestine, in the lands of Jerusalem, it essentially strengthened Napoleon's control over where? Egypt, because he's taken Egypt. So by having a buffer zone of Zionists or Jews in that region, it would essentially prevent the Ottomans from taking the lands of Egypt back. And secondly, as we mentioned, Napoleon was having great difficulties trying to sort of invade those lands, and by having the Jews, and these are Jews at the moment, right? Zionism is not actually a thing. But by having the Jews support his revolution, it of course would gain him backing from Jewish bankers in Europe, but also it would help his campaign. It would facilitate the expansion into these lands. Let us now shift our attention back to Europe. So in Europe during this time, this is the 1800s. So if we just go back, this is the time scale. So we're sort of familiar with it. So 1789 was the French invasion of where? Egypt, yeah. And now we're going to make our way towards anti-Semitism in Europe during the 1800s. So in the 1800s, there is these huge waves of anti-Semitism espoused by the European colonialists. So the Russian Empire is one of them, yeah? They were the bastions of anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe. So the Ashkenazi Jews are Jews that are originated from Eastern Europe, so places like Ukraine, Russia. And during the 1800s, under Tsar Alexander III, he is the leader of the Russians, he orchestrates these mass pogroms, one of them being in 1881. A pogrom is a massive massacre, a large-scale massacre. The Jews were rounded up, they were butchered, or they were forced to flee, they were exiled, yeah? And so now what you have is that the Russians blaming the Jews for all the problems, the turmoils of the Russian government during this time. The Russians are bankrupt. They had waged wars against the Ottomans, and so they needed a scapegoat, and that, naturally speaking, was the Jews. So there was this idea that the Jews were not welcomed in Europe, and they needed to find a home elsewhere. So thus begins, look at this very great diagram. So they all flee to the lands of Palestine. In 1881, this is known as the first Aliyah. Aliyah in Hebrew essentially means massive migration. That would happen from 1881 right up until 1903, and around 35,000 Jews would make their way to the lands of Palestine. Under the Russian regime, you were not able to own agricultural land. They prevented you, they limited you from having land, buying land, and actually using the land for produce. So when they came to Palestine, it was heaven for them. They could buy all the land they wanted, and so they began to make settlements. This is the beginnings, this is the foundation of the settlements. And there were 8 prejudicial settlements built in the 1800s, towards the beginning of the 1900s. And these prejudicial settlements were a problem because when the Jews bought the land, they would expel the Arabs from the land, and they were not even able to work in them lands again. So you're culling an entire workforce of people. So this was a problem for the people. But then again, there was another mass migration, the second Aliyah, from 1904 to 1914, and this is where we see the formation, the strengthening of these prejudicial settlements. But it wasn't enough for the Jewish community, and this is where you see Zionism actually form. So there was this idea that the Jews needed to find a problem to the Jewish question, to their problems. But also the Europeans needed to find a solution to the Jewish problem. The Jews needed a homeland, and the Europeans wanted them out of Europe. So both of their interests infused together. Even though they wanted different things, both of these interests infused together. And so now you have the formation of Zionism. And so in 1897, the Zionists would gather for the first World Zionist Conference, and it was held in Geneva, Switzerland. Till today, this conference takes place every single year. And it was spearheaded by the ideologue of Zionism. And who would that be? Don't know if anyone knows. Theodor Herzl, brilliant, Theodor Herzl, he would be the ideologue of Zionism. Once again, he was an atheist. He was the father, you could say, of Zionism, and till today, his teachings, his works, are still being quoted from by Zionist officials in the Israeli government today. So this is not some random dude of the past that has a really weird beard, but this is a guy who is very much at the heart of the policies that are happening today in Gaza. And if you go to Israel, you'll actually see portraits and posters of him scattered everywhere. So this conference in 1897, this is about 100 years after Napoleon does his stuff in Egypt and Palestine. And this conference basically concludes that, look, we need a homeland. Where are we going to find this homeland? Because originally it wasn't Palestine that was going to be this homeland. But at this conference, they had concluded that Palestine would indeed be the homeland of the Jewish people, and they would do everything in order to establish this. And so even if that meant expelling the people that were already on these lands. So the Zionists had a catchphrase. It was, the Jewish people are a people without a nation, but Palestine is a nation without a people. They essentially dismissed the fact that there were hundreds upon thousands, if not a million, Muslims, Christians, Palestinian Arabs living on these lands. They seemingly dismissed that, and they said, look, it's just a barren desert. Why don't we settle in these lands? So there's a Zionist essayist. His name is Asher Ginsburg, and he visited the Ottoman lands. He visited Palestine in particular. And he says, we abroad are accustomed to believe that Palestine nowadays is entirely desolate, a barren land where anyone can buy land till their heart's content. In fact, it is not so. In the country, it is hard to find arable land that is not cultivated. So that, once again, expels the idea that there was nobody in Palestine. And that's, once again, the reason why I asked you at the beginning, what do you think of Palestine before the occupation? According to Zionists, nobody was there. It's just a complete barren desert. So Herzl now, he goes, okay, we've settled on Palestine, but how on earth are we going to get it? Shahir asked me a question before. He said, why did the Jews want to support the French in taking back Palestine? Well, they needed the support of the French. The Jews were not powerful enough. Of course, they had the wealth and things like that, but they didn't have an imperial backer. So Herzl goes on a shopping spree in Europe. He needs to find an imperial backer that can help him finance the taking of Palestine. So naturally speaking, where would he go to? The owner of the lands, the Ottomans. So Sultan Abdul Hamid II, one of the last good caliphs of the Ottoman Empire, he has a meeting with Theodor Herzl in 1901, yeah? Bear in mind the date. In 1901, he goes up to Sultan Abdul Hamid and goes, look, I know that you're suffering, from a massive debt crisis. You've pretty much lost the entirety of your territory in the Balkans. Why don't we offer something that you can't reject? There's no way that you're going to reject this. Why don't we clear your debt and we'll give you and we'll have Palestine in return? So this is a cash cow for the Ottomans. Can you imagine having your debts cleared, zero? Yeah. Apparently they say 10 billion or 2 billion was offered to Sultan Abdul Hamid II. But the Sultan knew exactly what he was doing. Yeah. His fortitude, the respect I have for him is immense. Sultan Abdul Hamid, even with this huge proposition, he actually turns around and says, I cannot sell even a foot of land, for it does not belong to me. Let the Jews save their billions, and when my empire is partitioned, they may get Palestine for free. I won't divide Palestine. This can only happen by you dividing our bodies into pieces. And so Herzl was like, sheesh, all right, calm down, pal. I guess we'll have to go somewhere else. So that's the Ottomans out of the question. And by the way, during the 1800s, the Ottomans are realizing the intent of the Zionists, and they implement laws in Palestine to restrict them from actually buying land and buying more land to expand their prejudicial settlements. So Herzl is a bit, annoyed because obviously the Ottomans had said no. Then we move to the British, of course. So Herzl dies in 1904, and he's replaced by Chaim Weizmann. He's the new head of the World Zionist Organization. And he makes his way over to Manchester. Why Manchester? Well, because Manchester was the heart of Zionist activity in Britain. Yeah, and so he would make his way through the corridors of power in the British government, in the Parliament, making his claim for a Jewish homeland. And he manages to find an audience with a man whose name is synonymous with the loss of Palestine. Anybody know his name? I'm going to give a hint. Balfour, yeah? Arthur Balfour. He is the ex-prime minister at the time. He was the foreign secretary of Britain. And so Chaim Weizmann, this new head of Zionist activity, he pressures Arthur Balfour. And he says, look, we need a homeland somewhere. Can you give us something? And so Balfour goes, okay, we'll give you a proposition. The British Empire is vast and it has a bunch of territory, so yeah, we can give you whatever you want. So he goes up to the Zionists, once again, getting them conflated together. He goes up to the Zionist organization. He goes, look, we'll offer you Cyprus. Yeah, we'll give you Cyprus and you can make your nice little Jewish state in Cyprus. Of course, the Zionists are not going to accept that, and they actually reject it. And then the British go, okay, we'll give you the Sinai Peninsula. Yeah, this is near Egypt. This is basically a desert. And they say no. And then the British are like, okay, I'm going to give you a solution, a proposition that you can't reject. Why don't we give you Uganda? And the Zionists are like, what on earth? If I didn't accept flipping Cyprus and Sinai, why am I going to accept Uganda? It's nowhere near anyone, okay? So the Zionists said, no, we're going to settle only on Palestine, only on the lands of Al-Aqsa. And Balfour said, okay. And that was his promise. Balfour promised Chaim Weizmann that he would grant the Zionist community the lands of Palestine. But why? Yeah, why is this guy, Balfour, giving the lands of Palestine to the Zionists? Yeah, what was in it for them? There's three reasons, once again. One of the reasons being, by portraying the British Empire to be the sponsors of a homeland for, the oppressed Jews, it essentially would serve as a justification for the British occupation of those lands. And it basically legitimized the British invasions into the Ottoman Empire. And obviously, once again, if you have control over Palestine, it would be a line of defense to protect the British assets in Egypt, because the British have Egypt now. In the 1800s, I believe it's the 1880s, the British have Egypt and the Suez Canal. So by having a friendly Zionist entity in Palestine, it could help us serve as a buffer zone. Once again, the strategic reasons behind that. Another reason was the intense Zionist lobbying and the strong connections between the Zionist community and Britain and the British government. And some of the officials, like we mentioned, Chaim Weizmann being one of the proponents of this idea of establishing a homeland in Palestine. Also another reason, the final one, being the anti-Semitic reasons. Once again, these are the same continuous reasons why the French Emperor Napoleon issued his proclamation, yeah? The idea that if we can solve the Jewish problem, get them into some land in Palestine, we could resolve the problem in Europe and we can expel these sort of outcasts of society. So the British were like, okay, fair enough, it'll benefit us if we take Palestine. So in 1914, the perfect scenario was crafted to establish British control over Palestine. That scenario was the Great War, the war to end all wars, the First World War. And so the last call for jihad was actually declared against the British and French in the First World War by the Ottoman Caliph. And he had issued that because in the lands of the British and French, you had a huge number of Muslims. In India, yeah, you had millions of Muslims. In the French territories in northern Africa, you have Algeria, Tunisia at some point. So this is a huge blow to the British and French. If you have the Ottomans siding with the Germans to so-called repel these colonialist forces from the Muslim world, it's going to be extremely detrimental. So the British knew that they had to wage war against the Ottomans. So, like I said, the Ottomans side with the Germans in the war. But what a grave mistake that would be, because the Germans ended up losing and the Ottoman lands were now sort of up for grabs. And the Ottoman Empire was dwindling. Its power was a shadow of its former self. It wasn't as powerful as it once had been. So the lands of the Ottomans were overrun by the British. Yeah? They launched massive campaigns in the Middle East, in Egypt, and of course in Palestine. This would be the window opportunity for the Zionist movement to take Palestine. If they miss this opportunity, then they may never get the chance again. So the Zionists would use the battles and conquests of the First World War to advance this aim of establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The British haven't even won the war yet, but Balfour makes a declaration very similar to Napoleon's declaration, his proclamation. And Balfour makes his declaration in 1917 before the British have even, taken control over Palestine. And I'll read it. It's a very short declaration, but it's very important to understand how the British control over Palestine would facilitate this expansionist Zionist entity in Palestine. So the letter is as follows. Dear Lord Rothschild. Rothschild is a figurehead of the British community, British Jewish community. And he says, I have the pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. And he says, His Majesty's government view with the favour of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object. Now this declaration, it had to be ratified by the government, yeah? And everybody agreed on this proclamation, this declaration in 1917, bar one man. His name was Edwin Montagu, an important name. A very, very important name, because he was the only, you can't make this stuff up, he was the only Jewish member of parliament, and he was the only one that opposed the idea of establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine. So the British begin to rapidly move into Ottoman territory, and they're getting the Sharif of Mecca to make concessions and revolt against the Ottomans, and now you have the carving up of the Middle East. In 1917 you have a Sykes-Picot Agreement where they essentially, in an air-conditioned room in France, partitioned the Middle East with pens and rulers, without giving due consideration to the ethical and the ethic makeup of the Middle East. And so the First World War is coming to a halt, and the Ottomans were fiercely defending Al-Aqsa. And the British are getting frustrated, so the Prime Minister makes a bold claim. He says that the lands of Jerusalem will be a Christmas gift for the British people. And lo and behold, on December 11th, 1917, General Allenby strides into Jerusalem, and his troops parade through the city, and he declares on that historic occasion that the wars of the Crusades are now complete. And on that day, the Muslims had lost Jerusalem, never to return again. The British had done it. They had achieved what the Crusaders in the 1100s had failed to accomplish, and that was taking the lands of Palestine. But they hadn't taken the lands of Al-Aqsa and Jerusalem for Christendom, but this time they had taken it for the cause of Zionism. After 1,400 years of Muslim Islamic rule in the region, they had taken back Jerusalem. And so from that moment, the Ummah would never be the same again. From that moment, Al-Aqsa was lost. The British control over Palestine had indeed commenced, and the impacts of which were irreversible. if there was one policy that the British control over Palestine from the years 1917 all the way up until 1947, if there's one policy that it was driven by, it was to establish a friendly Jewish entity in Palestine. Because the British knew that, you know what, we're not going to be here forever. Yeah? We're going to have to give these territories back to the independent nations, yeah? So the Arabs. But they couldn't make a friendly nation if you're Arab Muslims. Yeah? You need to be Europeans. You need to be like us. So they would do everything to establish the influx of Jews, of Zionists to this region. They would arm them, they would equip them, they would prejudicially give them more power than the natives, yeah? Even though the natives consisted of 90%. Yeah? They would do everything to facilitate this Zionist entity. And the British, this isn't the first place that it happened. The British did this in South Africa. It's done it in America, in Canada, in Australia. In South Africa, for example, just before the British were giving South Africa its independence, yeah, they facilitated the sort of domination of whites in the South African government. That way, once South Africa, even when it has gained its independence and is detached from Britain, the British can still retain some sort of influence over the region. And so the British would do the exact same with Palestine. They would make Israel a beacon of light in the darkness of the Arab world. But there was one problem to this grand scheme of establishing this homeland. Where were they going to put the Arabs? The simple answer to that was ethnic cleansing. Jazakallah khair. I will see you hopefully next week, inshallah. That was beautiful. Jazakallah khair.
Literally, I wanted to never do it.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وأخرى تحبونها نصر من الله وفتح قريب وبشر المؤمنين يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا أنصار الله كما قال عيسى ابن مريم للحواريين من أنصاري إلى الله قال الحواريون نحن أنصار الله